As the most complex structure in the human body, the brain plays a major part in different functions, different organs, different systems, different tissues of the body. It majorly controls several aspects of the body. The brain is located at the head and it's central to the central nervous system. It is also estimated that the human brain consists of more than 100 billion neurons, which connects to each other and ensure smooth transmission of impulses in and out of the brain for effective actions in the body. Welcome to Nursing Tutorials with Joel. In today's lesson, I'll be showing you the structures that makes up the brain and the functions of these various structures. So stay put as we learn about this. Promises to be informative and explorative. Welcome once again, and let's begin. The human brain is the most complex structure in the body. And just as we said, it is located at the cranial cavity where the head is located. All this within the skull. The brain majorly is enclosed within the skull. And it's also centered to the central nervous system, just as we've said earlier on. Now, basically, the human brain is divided into three major parts. We have the cerebrum, we have the brainstem, and we have the cerebellum. So, to begin with, we'll start with the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain, and it's the most obvious part in any picture you see, or even if there's a physical brain now, the most obvious part you can see is what? The cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is what makes human beings to be unique. It's a major part of the brain that makes we humans to be very, very unique. Because animals, they can do so many things that we do. Animals move, they digest food, they excrete, and the likes. The cerebrum, on a broad day, is divided into right and left hemispheres. Call it hemispheres. Hemi means half. So the cerebrum is divided into the right and to the left hemispheres. The right hemisphere is just a mirror of the left hemisphere, meaning that the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, they are just the same thing. However, in some people, the right part of the brain dominates while the left part is less dominant, that is recessive, and vice versa. Another thing we should understand is that the right part of the brain controls the left part of body movements. So, for example, like in stroke, which we've commonly seen, you discover that if somebody is affected in the left part of the brain, you discover that the person's limbs on the right side will not be active. The person will be having paralysis, cannot move the limbs only on the right side. Why? Because the right part of the cerebrum controls the left part of the body, and vice versa. Alright, that's just a passing information. Now, basically, the cerebrum is divided into four lobes, four partitions. The first one is the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, we have the occipital lobe, and finally we have the temporal lobe. Now, beginning with the frontal lobe, this is the most anterior part of the brain located at the front of the head. That's like constitutes the front of the head. And most importantly, it has a lot of distinct functions. In fact, this frontal lobe is the seat of intelligence for every human. In fact, the frontal lobe is what controls our reasoning. When you reason things out, problem solving, when you are thinking of how to solve a problem, judgments, decision making, they all happen majorly at the frontal lobe. Then another thing the frontal lobe is responsible for is movement. Moving our hands, moving our legs, and the likes. We're able to do that because of the functioning of the frontal lobe. Then the next one is that it helps us to plan. So when you make out plans, maybe you want to go to the market or you want to go to the grocery store and you are looking for some things, you plan what you want. Higher functions are performed in the frontal lobe. Then the frontal lobe also helps us in memory. memorizing things, helps us to build our memory. Then behavior, our behavior, the way we act, our personality, whether you are introvert, you are extrovert, you are sanguine, choleric, melancholy, and or whatsoever. The frontal lobe is the house of our personality, our behaviors. Then also is responsible for speech. The frontal lobes helps us produce sound, speech production. So there's specifically a little portion that is allocated to that, and that portion is called Broca's area. The Broca's area. It's located at the frontal lobe. When there is a damage to this part, the person cannot talk, meaning that the person becomes dumb. I believe we've heard of deaf and dumb. So when the person is dumb, meaning that he or she cannot produce speech, and this part is affected, that's called the Broca's area. Now, let's go to the next lobe. We have the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is located in between the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe. So it's just located at the center of the head, at the crown of the head. Now, what is the major function of the parietal lobe? One of the major key functions of the parietal lobe is perception. Perception, understanding impulses. Another way to put it is sensations. Understanding sensations. So meaning that if I have an apple and I taste it, I'll be able to know if the apple is sweet or not. Why? Because of the parietal lobe. Isn't that interesting? The food we eat, we are able to have an idea of either if it is sweet, bitter, or sour. Why? Because of the parietal lobe. Not only that, temperature, hotness or coldness, you're able to sense it because of the parietal lobe. Also, touch, you know when someone touches you in a hard way or in a soft way because of the parietal lobe. So, another thing is attention, comprehension, calculations, and body awareness. Now, the parietal lobe is what helps us to calculate. Mathematical skills is built mainly in the parietal lobe. And comprehensions, when we read, we're able to understand what we are reading as a result of the parietal lobe. So, another thing is the body awareness. That is knowing whether you are tilting to the right or tilting to the left. That is a function of the parietal lobe. So when there's a damage to the parietal lobe, they discover that the person cannot sense, cannot taste, cannot smell, cannot feel temperature again. The person cannot pay attention to things. The person cannot comprehend what he or she reads. The person develops difficulty in writing and sometimes difficulty in reading and understanding. So that's that about the parietal lobe. The next on the list is the temporal lobe. Now, this lobe is located at the side of the brain. Now, located close to the ear, just the ear portion of the brain, and is just behind the frontal lobe. Now, what's the major function of the temporal lobe? The temporal lobe aids our hearing. It helps us to understand what we have heard. So the temporal lobe helps us. For instance, someone is speaking now, I lean my ears to hear. The part that helps me to understand what I'm hearing is the temporal lobe of the brain, of the cerebrum. Another thing it helps us to get is the memory, especially visual and auditory memory. Memories of what we've heard and memories of what we see, majorly found in the temporal lobe. Then also, the temporal lobes helps us understand languages. Understanding what we hear helps us to process languages. And finally, it also helps us in attention, giving attention to details, to what we listen to. It helps us to be able to concentrate on what we are hearing. Now, let's move over to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe has a primary function, and that is what? Sight, vision. So meaning that the occipital lobe processes visual information. That's the major function of the occipital lobe. So when we see a particular thing, for instance, I'm looking at this whiteboard and I know you're also looking at it. When you look at it, there are signals that enters your eyes, there are light rays that fall into your eyes, and these signals and impulses are taken back to the back of the brain, which is the occipital lobe, and over there you are able to understand that, oh, what I'm seeing is a white board. Oh, the wall is blue. Oh, there is a tree over there. Why? Because the occipital lobe has processed that information for us. So the occipital lobe specializes in visual processing. Now, when there's damage to the occipital lobe, you discover that there will be a problem with our vision. There will be visual impairment. So now, having known that, we've talked on this frontal lobe. We've said that damage to the frontal lobe produces dumbness. Sometimes it could be difficulty in planning, inability to memorize things. Damage to the frontal lobe could bring about personality disorders. Also, to the parietal lobe, damage to the parietal lobe, it could cause impaired attention. We could have difficulty in comprehending things and even difficulty in reading and writing. That's that of the parietal lobe. Then when it comes to the temporal lobe, somebody can be deaf. The person is not able to understand what he or she hears. And there's an area in the temporal lobe called the Wernicke's area, which is concerned majorly with processing information, understanding what we hear. So when somebody is deaf, the person can hear, but he or she does not understand. Why? Because the Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe could be affected. And the same goes for occipital lobe. Damage to the occipital lobe leads to sight impairment. Now let's go to the next part of the brain, which is called the brain stem. The brain stem is just a little part in the brain which controls vital functions in the body. Take, for example, our breathing, our blood pressure. All these things are things that the brainstem controls. Now, for sake of understanding, the brainstem is divided majorly into three parts also. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, or simply put, the medulla. But many people know it as medulla oblongata. Yes, this is where it falls in. Now, this is the midbrain, and this is the pons, and this is the medulla. We'll say the medulla oblongata. Now, the midbrain is just located immediately after the temporal lobe, that is beneath the brain, inside, within, and it functions majorly in eye movement. It contributes to our eye movement. So for me to move my eyes to the right, to the left, up, down, sideways, and the rest is as a result of contributions from the midbrain. Also, in the midbrain, there is a structure, a little portion that is called the substantia nigra. This substantia nigra is rich in dopamine, and any problem, any impairment to this substantia nigra is what leads to Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a disease characterized by tremor, shaking, and maybe some other giltrins and the rest. Now, that's the significance of having issues with the midbrain. Next on the list is the pons. The pons is just located in between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. The pons helps us control our sleep. It helps us control our sleep cycles. Also consists of some of the origination of the cranial nerves. So meaning that most of the cranial nerves originate from the pons. Now, what does this imply? The cranial nerves are nerves that control most part of the face, the head, and the likes. There are 12 cranial nerves. Now, these cranial nerves are what are responsible for tearing, your tears, chewing, responsible for facial expressions, frowning, smiling, and happiness expressions, and the likes. So once this pons is affected, there will be issues with facial expressions, there will be issues with tearing and chewing and the likes. Also, there will be issues with sleep sleep circles. Then the last is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is located just beneath the pons and it continues into the spinal cord. So, in the brain, the connection between the brain and the spinal cord is mediated by the medulla oblongata. Now, what are the functions of the medulla oblongata? We have reflexes, control of reflexes. For example, coughing, sneezing, vomiting. These are reflexes, things you just do abruptly. The body helps you expel things that maybe foreign organisms that are not supposed to be. So the medulla oblongata controls reflexes. And secondly, it contains vital centers in the body. For example, the medulla oblongata controls breathing. It also controls heart movement, that is cardiovascular, and also it helps in control of BP by certain receptors which are located at the medulla oblongata. So our blood pressure is controlled in the medulla oblongata. Now, the final one is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is located just behind the medulla oblongata. And the Latin meaning of cerebellum means little brain. If you look at it, it's just as if it's a smaller version of the whole brain. Now, what are the functions of the cerebellum? The cerebellum controls balance. It helps us maintain balance. So you are able to walk coordinatedly without shaking to the more to the right, more to the left. Why? Because of the cerebellum. It also helps us in coordination of movements and skills. So we have fine movements. You are able to walk majestically and catwalk. Why? Because of the good functioning of the cerebellum. If there's any damage to the cerebellum, our movements will be affected, will begin to shake, our gait becomes unstable. Another thing is skills, ability to play instruments, sporting activities, football, tennis, basketball, coordination, things that deals with your hands, sewing, dexterity, swimming, things that needs you to be coordinated. The cerebellum is responsible for that. So any little damage to the cerebellum can hinder these functions. So overall, these are the structures that makes up the brain. There are still other structures, but basically these are the structures that makes up the brain. I would like you to subscribe in case you have not done that. I'd like you to subscribe for more videos.